Exactly at 8:14 in the morning local time, the American pilot of a P-51D Mustang was executing a mission that pushed the very limits of human endurance. He was flying a grueling 8-hour, 1,500-mile round trip from the newly captured airstrips of Iwo Jima directly into the heart of the Japanese Empire. What he was about to prove over the skies of Tokyo would forever shatter the defensive strategy of the Imperial Japanese military and change the course of the Pacific War. The briefing had promised heavy resistance from elite home defense squadrons, and the pilot was about to discover the truth of those words at 400 miles per hour. The silver fighter roared northward at 20,000 feet, leaving the endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean beneath its perfectly engineered laminar flow wings. This was the most dangerous phase of the approach, crossing the invisible threshold where Japanese early warning radars would finally pick up their metallic signatures. There was no gray zone here, only the freezing, thin air of the upper atmosphere and the harsh reality that bailing out meant certain death in the freezing waters below. He was locked in a tiny, unheated cockpit for over 3 hours already, his body aching from the vibrations of the massive Packard V1 650 Merlin engine right in front of him. The air around his formation was eerily empty, a stark contrast to the massive B-29 Superfortress bomber streams they were assigned to protect later in the mission. Below him, thick blankets of white clouds obscured the Japanese coastline, hiding the sprawling industrial complexes and the frantic preparations of the anti-aircraft batteries. The Japanese commanders had long believed that their home islands were safe from single-engine fighter sweeps because no known Allied fighter had the range to reach Tokyo and return. That fundamental miscalculation was about to be violently corrected when this swarm of Mustangs finally broke through the cloud cover and descended upon the capital. At precisely 22,000 feet, the pilot's radio crackled with a burst of static, followed by the sharp, tense voice of his squadron leader calling out enemy bogies. It was not a drill, and it was not a false radar echo bouncing off the turbulent weather fronts that constantly battered the Japanese home islands. Dozens of dark silhouettes were climbing aggressively through the cloud breaks ahead, their radial engines straining to reach the high-altitude intercept points before the Americans could react. These were not the outdated Zeros of the early war, but heavily armed Ki-84 Hayates and menacing N-1K George fighters, flown by desperate, experienced veterans. The pilot reacted with pure instinct, his left hand violently pushing the throttle forward while reaching to release the heavy external drop tanks that had fueled his journey. 2 hollow thuds echoed through the airframe as the 75-gallon teardrop tanks detached, instantly freeing the Mustang from its aerodynamic drag and transforming it into an apex predator. The nose of the fighter pitched up slightly as the weight vanished, and the immense torque of the Merlin engine pressed his spine hard against the armored seat. He was accelerating rapidly, trading the sluggish handling of a heavily burdened long-range cruiser for the terrifying agility of a pure air superiority fighter. He pushed the control stick forward, pointing the aggressive spinner of his P-51 directly toward the climbing swarm of Japanese defenders who were still thousands of feet below. This was the boom and zoom tactic, a physical embodiment of energy fighting that relied on raw speed and overwhelming firepower rather than tight turning engagements. The altimeter spun backward as he dove, slicing through the freezing air at 450 miles per hour, closing the distance faster than the enemy could process. The Japanese pilots, expecting to face unescorted bombers or slower heavy fighters, were suddenly staring down the barrels of 6 perfectly synchronized 50-caliber Browning machine guns. The first Ki-84 Hayate expanded rapidly in his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, the revolutionary targeting system that automatically calculated the lead required to hit a moving target. He did not need to guess the deflection angle. He simply placed the glowing reticle over the dark green fuselage of the enemy fighter and squeezed the trigger. 6 heavy machine guns erupted simultaneously, sending a blinding stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tearing through the sky at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The Japanese fighter never even had a chance to evade before the concentrated storm of lead shredded its right wing root and ignited its unprotected fuel tanks. A massive fireball blossomed in the gray morning sky, marking the violent end of the interceptor as the Mustang tore straight through the expanding cloud of debris. He did not bother to watch the burning wreckage spiral toward the ocean, because his situational awareness was already hyper-focused on the next immediate threat entering his peripheral vision. 2 more enemy fighters were aggressively braking left, attempting to drag the heavy American fighter into a low-speed turning fight where their lighter airframes would hold a deadly advantage. It was the classic trap that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots earlier in the war, but the Mustang was a completely different beast, built for a different kind of war. Instead of turning to follow them, the pilot pulled back hard on the stick, using his massive speed advantage to rocket straight up into the vertical plane. The G-forces crushed his chest, draining the blood from his head and threatening to drag him into a terrifying blackout as the fighter clawed its way toward 25,000 feet. He was perfectly exploiting the P-51's incredible energy retention, converting his kinetic diving speed back into potential altitude where the oxygen-starved Japanese radial engines simply could not follow. When he finally leveled off at the apex of his climb, he looked down to see the two enemy fighters stalling helplessly in the thin air far below him. He rolled his Mustang inverted, pulling the nose down through the horizon to initiate another punishing high-speed dive upon the completely defenseless targets. This relentless vertical cycle of diving, firing, and climbing was utterly demoralizing to the Japanese defenders, who found themselves constantly attacked from above by an untouchable enemy. They could not outrun the P-51, they could not outclimb it, and any attempt to dive away only resulted in the heavily streamlined American fighter catching them within seconds. The psychological shock of this sudden, overwhelming dominance over their own capital city was spreading through the Japanese radio frequencies like a paralyzing virus. As he plummeted toward the second target, the chilling realization of their absolute technological superiority settled into the cold, calculated combat logic of his mind. The Japanese military had spent years fortifying Tokyo against bomber streams, relying on the sheer distance from Allied bases to protect their interceptors from fighter escorts. Now, looking through his reinforced canopy, he saw an entire defensive network unraveling in real time as Mustangs ruthlessly dismantled the previously secure Japanese interceptor squadrons. He squeezed the trigger again, sending a 2-second burst into the engine cowling of a stalling Zero, watching the oil and smoke erupt instantly over its canopy. Another kill was confirmed, but the sky was still a chaotic, swirling nightmare of contrails, tracer fire, and burning machines falling toward the urban sprawl below. He checked his 6 o'clock, his head constantly swiveling on a neck that ached from the extreme G-loading, making sure no unseen predator was slipping into his blind spot. The radio traffic was a continuous barrage of frantic warnings, victory calls, and the heavy breathing of men fighting for their lives in the harshest environment on Earth. He spotted a solitary B-29 superfortress a few miles to the east, smoking heavily from its No. 3 engine and struggling to maintain its formation altitude. A pair of nimble Japanese fighters had singled out the wounded bomber, moving in for the kill like wolves isolating a crippled beast from the safety of the herd. The pilot did not hesitate. He jammed the throttle to the firewall, engaging the war emergency power that dumped extra manifold pressure into the screaming V-12 engine. The Mustang surged forward, accelerating past 400 miles per hour in a shallow, desperately fast intercept trajectory toward the doomed superfortress and its tormentors. He was fighting a merciless clock, knowing that if the Japanese fighters closed within a few hundred yards, their heavy 20mm cannons would tear the B-29 apart. The distance closed with terrifying speed, the massive silver bomber expanding in his windshield while the two dark Japanese interceptors focused entirely on their target. He was coming in from a difficult deflection angle, requiring his gyroscopic sight to calculate a massive lead that forced him to aim into the empty air ahead of the enemy. He pressed the firing button at a distance of 600 yards, an extremely long shot that relied entirely on the terrifying volume of fire his 6 heavy machine guns could produce. The brilliant streaks of tracer rounds arched across the sky, creating a deadly net of crossfire that intersected perfectly with the flight path of the trailing Japanese fighter. The enemy aircraft flew directly into the blinding stream of lead, its canopy shattering instantly as the heavy rounds ripped through the cockpit and the vital engine components. It violently snapped into an uncontrolled flat spin, spiraling away from the crippled bomber without ever firing a single shot at the vulnerable American crew inside. The surviving Japanese wingman, realizing that an unseen apex predator had just obliterated his leader, instantly abandoned the attack and dove frantically toward the safety of the cloud cover. The pilot of the Mustang pulled up sharply, banking gently alongside the battered B-29 so the terrified gunners could see the distinct, reassuring profile of their guardian angel. Through the reinforced glass of the bomber, he could see the waist gunners waving frantically, their faces pale but relieved as they pointed their heavy weapons away from him. He had just saved 11 lives, but the mission was far from over, and the fuel gauges on his instrument panel were already demanding his absolute attention. Fighting at maximum throttle had consumed massive amounts of high-octane aviation gas, and he still had to navigate 750 miles of featureless ocean to reach Iwo Jima. If his engine choked, or if he miscalculated his navigation by even a fraction of a degree, he would vanish forever into the unforgiving depths of the Pacific. He pulled back on the throttle, settling the overworked engine into a strictly calculated cruise setting that prioritized maximum fuel efficiency over combat speed. The adrenaline that had flooded his system during the life-or-death engagement was suddenly crashing, leaving him exhausted, sweaty, and shivering in the freezing temperatures of the high-altitude cockpit. Around him, the scattered remnants of the Mustang squadrons were slowly reforming, turning their distinctive, square-tipped wings southward toward a home base that felt impossibly far away. The sky over Tokyo, previously dominated by confident Japanese interceptors, was now completely clear of enemy fighters, standing as a silent testament to the absolute slaughter that had just occurred. The Japanese military command on the ground could only listen in horrified silence to the frantic radio reports of their veteran pilots being systematically hunted down and destroyed. They had just witnessed the complete collapse of their final defensive illusion, realizing that not even their sovereign airspace was safe from the relentless reach of the American war machine. The P-51 Mustang had shattered the psychological barrier of the island nation, proving that bombers could now strike with impunity under the protective umbrella of invincible escort fighters. This dreadful realization spread quickly through the highest ranks of the Imperial Command, marking the beginning of the inevitable end for their entire aerial war effort. As the Japanese coastline disappeared beneath the thick cloud layer, the pilot found himself alone again with the hypnotic, terrifying drone of the Merlin engine. Every slight hesitation in the engine's rhythm, every imaginary change in pitch, sent a jolt of pure panic straight through his exhausted nervous system. He constantly scanned the horizon, fighting the hypnotic fatigue that threatened to lull him into a deadly sleep while the icy ocean waited patiently thousands of feet below. His map and compass were his only lifelines, a terrifyingly analog navigation system that required absolute concentration in an era long before the invention of satellite positioning. Hour after hour dragged on in the cramped, agonizingly uncomfortable seat of the fighter, forcing him to manually shift his weight to prevent his legs from going entirely numb. The fuel needle was hovering dangerously close to the empty peg on his internal tanks, transforming the final hour of the flight into a harrowing psychological torture session. He was staring intensely through the scratched plexiglass canopy, desperately searching the gray, hazy horizon for the tiny, volcanic speck of black sand that represented salvation. Missing Iwo Jima meant ditching in the ocean, a maneuver that the heavily armored, scoop-bellied Mustang was notoriously bad at surviving without instantly flipping over and trapping its pilot. Finally, a faint smudge appeared on the horizon, breaking the perfect, maddening line where the dark ocean met the gray, overcast sky of the Pacific Theater. It was Mount Suribachi, the iconic volcanic cone of Iwo Jima, standing like a dark, ugly lighthouse guiding the exhausted aviators back from the very edge of death. The pilot keyed his radio microphone, requesting landing clearance with a voice that was hoarse, dry, and trembling slightly from the sheer magnitude of the 8-hour ordeal. The control tower responded immediately, their calm, steady voices contrasting sharply with the terrifying mechanical realities of bringing a nearly empty fighter down onto a chaotic, crowded airstrip. He dropped his heavy landing gear, feeling the massive aerodynamic drag violently pull against the forward momentum of the aircraft as it descended toward the black volcanic ash. The flaps extended, forcing the nose down and giving him a clear view of the sprawling complex of tents, bombers, and emergency vehicles lining the vital runway. He carefully modulated the throttle, coaxing the absolute last drops of aviation fuel from the tanks to maintain a safe approach speed in the turbulent coastal crosswinds. The main wheels touched down with a harsh, screeching impact, kicking up clouds of dark dust as the heavy fighter finally reconnected with the solid earth. As he taxied the aircraft toward the designated hardstand, the massive Packard Merlin engine sputtered twice, choked on the final fumes of gasoline, and abruptly died. The sudden, overwhelming silence in the cockpit was deafening, a surreal contrast to the 8 hours of roaring mechanical violence that had just defined his entire existence. He unbuckled his heavy flight harness with trembling hands, slowly sliding back the canopy to let the warm, humid air of the Pacific island wash over his frozen face. The ground crew scrambled up onto the wings, their faces grim but deeply respectful as they immediately began inspecting the battle damage in the empty ammunition bays. He climbed down from the wing, his legs barely supporting his weight as he touched the black sand, completely drained of all physical and emotional energy. The mission was technically categorized as an immense historical success, achieving a devastating kill ratio and securing absolute air dominance over the previously untouchable Japanese capital. But for the pilot standing beside his cooling, ticking machine, there was no immediate sense of glorious victory or cinematic triumph over the fearsome enemy. There was only the bone-crushing exhaustion of survival, the lingering smell of high-octane fuel, and the terrifying knowledge that he would have to do it all over again tomorrow. The era of the unstoppable American long-range fighter had officially begun, breaking the ultimate defensive lines of the Japanese Empire with terrifying speed and overwhelming firepower. The P-51 Mustang had proven to the entire world that a single-engine fighter could cross vast oceans, outfight elite interceptors, and bring absolute destruction to the enemy's doorstep. It was a technological and human triumph that completely rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, leaving the Japanese air defense forces paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the threat. If you enjoyed this intense look into historical aviation combat, make sure to check out our video on how a lone P-47 Thunderbolt survived an entire German squadron.